Yeah, as I make this program this morning, we are getting reports of a major cruise missile strike by the Russian Air Force against Ukraine. Information is still trickling in, and I don't yet know exactly how many missiles the Russians will have launched, but we have had a report about it, brief report as always, from the Russian Defense Ministry. It says that last night the Russian aerospace forces delivered a strike by long-range precision weaponry, including Kinzhal hypersonic missiles at Ukrainian military decision-making centers, logistic bases, temporary deployment areas of special operations forces, and foreign mercenaries. The goal of the strike has been achieved. All targets have been engaged. And in fact, we seem to, the news seems to suggest that the epicenter of most of the strikes was Kiev, Ukraine's capital, and we are getting reports of lots of explosions being heard across Kiev. Now, I understand that the Ukrainians, for their part, whilst of course acknowledging that the strike is indeed taking place, are now back to their old habit of claiming that 95% of the missiles which were launched were shot down. As I think I might have mentioned in a recent program, a few days ago, the Ukrainian authorities announced the resignation or sacking of Yuri Ignat, the spokesman of Ukraine's air defense forces. This came shortly after the sacking of the commander, the overall commander of Ukraine's air defense forces. And I wonder whether one of the specific reasons why Ignat has been sacked is that it has always seemed to me that he has been embarrassed by some of the claims that Ukraine has made in the past about the number of targets that it has been shooting down, cruise missiles and all of the rest. He was, for example, for a time, denying claims which were circulating last year that Ukraine was shooting down Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. In fact, as I recall, he was going around television studios for a time, actively denying claims that Ukraine had shot down Kinzhal hypersonic missiles and saying that Ukraine lacked the capability to do that. He also regularly said that Ukraine lacked the capability to shoot down the massive Kh-22, 32 anti-ship missiles which the Russians have been using in a land attack capacity, missiles which have high supersonic but not quite hypersonic speeds. And I sort of get the impression, especially given the apparent change back to the policy of claiming that lots and lots and lots of missiles have been shot down when they clearly haven't been. I get the impression that someone in Kiev, or perhaps in Washington, or perhaps in London, was starting to become, frankly, irritated by Ignat's occasional, though not consistent, bursts of honesty, and felt that they needed to have someone acting again as the spokesman of Ukraine's air defense forces, someone who could be better relied upon to follow the media line. The media line being that most of the missiles, the great majority of them, 90% plus of them, get shot down. Anyway, whatever. A big Russian missile attack on Kiev. The Russians confirmed that hypersonic Kinzhal missiles were used in the attack. They also confirmed that it was directed at decision-making centers. And no doubt we will find out more about that in due course. Now, this has been the first missile attack of this nature in March. I don't yet know how many missiles were used. No doubt we will get more information over the course of the next few hours. the reports I am seeing are that the Russians have been able to basically hit targets that they have been striking at Kiev pretty much at will, and that the Ukrainian air defense system has been barely operational. And of course, it is also the case that, as many people have pointed out, Ukraine has had to shift large numbers of its air defense assets, its limited number of S-300 missile systems and Patriot missile systems to the line of contact, the battlefronts, in a desperate attempt to try to provide air defense cover for Ukraine's army, which has been pummeled by the Russian Air Force, operating these colossal and supremely powerful guided bombs, which the Russians have been deploying in huge quantities over the course of this year. So a lot of air defense assets have been deployed to the front lines, but I'm going to make a guess that Kiev will have retained most of its air defense assets. In other words, the air defense assets that Ukraine has deployed to the front lines have not come from Kiev so much as from other places. To make a plausible guess that the Ukrainian authorities will want to keep Kiev, at least, as secure as they can against missile strikes from the Russian military, even if that means that other places, important places across Ukraine, are being increasingly stripped of their air defense assets. I would not personally be surprised if before long we see Ukraine limiting its air defenses, its citywide air defenses, perhaps to 3 places: Kiev itself, Odessa, and perhaps Dnipro on the Dnieper River. Dnipro being, so far as I can judge, the main supply base of the Ukrainian forces fighting in Donbass. So that is a guess I would make. Of course, it also needs to be said that this particular missile strike is coming for Ukraine at a particularly bad moment. We have had a multiplicity of reports from across the Western media, but especially from the media of the United States, based on high-level briefings from the United States authorities, that Ukraine is now very short of air defense missiles, and that, in fact, at the end of March, it's going to have to restrict the number of air defense missiles it can launch against any particular Russian missile strike, because it will be so short of missiles that it is going to have to husband the few it still has. And it's conceded in these reports that Ukraine is increasingly going to have to concentrate its air defense assets on defending high-value targets in a few places, rather than trying to provide blanket coverage across Ukraine. Dima at the Military Summary Channel, incidentally, made also a pertinent point, which is that the destruction, the attrition of Ukrainian air defense assets on the borderline, on the front lines, which has been devastating. We'll come to that shortly. That this is now putting Ukraine in a position where they may have to start to make certain difficult choices, with the Russians possibly resuming missile strikes against Ukraine, across Ukraine. Do the Ukrainians continue to keep air defense assets close to the front lines, where they become easy targets for the Russians, with many of them being destroyed. Incidentally, only yesterday, in its latest Defense Ministry briefing, Russia claimed that it had destroyed another S-300 missile system. Destruction of these systems, big, powerful air defense systems like the Patriots and the S-300s, is now becoming so routine that it hardly attracts attention as perhaps it should. Do the Ukrainians continue to sacrifice their air defense system, what's left of it, trying to defend the troops on the front lines, or does it pull its air defense systems back to try to protect what high-value targets it has, even as the air defense system as a whole increasingly runs out of missiles? And Dima, again at the Military Summary Channel, made the entirely proper point that if Ukraine is driven to try to concentrate its few remaining air defense systems to defend high-value targets in selected cities and has to pull its air defense assets from the front lines, then that will mean that the Russian Air Force will be able to rampage in an unrestricted way across the battlefronts, wreaking even more damage upon the Ukrainians than it has been doing up to this point. So anyway, we will see what happens. But we need to wait a little, I think, to get a proper sense of what this missile strike is about and what is achieved. The reference to a strike on decision-making centres is tantalising. I wonder whether, in light of what has been going on the border of Belgorod and Kursk, the Russians have been on the hunt for Budanov again, just saying. But anyway, we will no doubt find out more over the next few hours, and I expect to make a further update about this in my programme tomorrow. Now, what has been going on the front lines? Well, before I get to that, I should say that the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, delivered a report to the Defense Ministry Board yesterday, and it gave us some further information about the overall situation on the battlefronts. And a number of interesting facts have been coming out of Moscow over the last few days. Now, before I proceed to discuss what Shoigu himself said, let me say that there is now information coming out about the situation in the Russian Navy. A few days ago, I picked up reports and mentioned them that the head of the Black Sea Fleet had been sacked, possibly in connection with the loss of the Ivan Kotov, and had been replaced by the commander of Russia's most powerful fleet, which is the Northern Fleet. And many were assuming that this was a sign that the Russians are very dissatisfied with the performance of the Black Sea Fleet and are putting their top naval commander in charge of the Black Sea Fleet. Well, we now have a correction to this information, because it turns out that the commander of the Northern Fleet has indeed been reassigned to new duties. But this is not command of the Black Sea Fleet. Rather, he has been appointed commander of the Russian Navy as a whole. I don't know what that means about the leadership of the Black Sea Fleet. Perhaps it is unchanged. Just saying. But anyway, let's get back to what Sergei Shoigu said at the Defense Ministry Board, which took place yesterday. And incidentally, I should say that the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with pictures. We see all sorts of senior commanders there, Shoigu delivering a presentation. Interestingly, I didn't see Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, present, but presumably he's still in Rostov, supervising the conduct of the special military operation itself. But anyway, this is what Shoigu had to say about the special military operation as a whole. He did have a lot of other things to say too, by the way, but he mentioned, for example, that Lieutenant General Andrei Buliga has just been appointed Deputy Prime Minister of Defense in charge of organizing logistics support for the Russian armed forces. That's interesting. It could reflect increased logistics support for the forces operating in the special military operation zone of the special military operation. Perhaps the Russians intend to step up even more supplies to their forces in the zone of the special military operation, and that's why Buliga has been appointed to that role. But anyway, he then went on to discuss the situation on the battlefronts. And he mentioned that in order, I'm now taking this from the Defense Ministry website, in order to disrupt election activities, the Kiev regime has used, well, Shoigu says, terrorist methods of pressure on Russian citizens. There was targeted shelling of polling places and state institutions where only civilians were present. This was known both to the Ukrainian commanding officers and to their Western advisors. Well, that's what he said. Russian troops intensified the protection of government and social facilities and reinforced the air defense system. And then he goes on to say, Ukrainian militants, he means Ukrainian troops, notice no acknowledgement here of any rogue Russian troops being involved in these attacks. Ukrainian troops attempted to seize border settlements in Belgorod and Kursk. The most intensive actions were carried out near Kozinka. All enemy attacks have been successfully repelled. The enemy has been driven back from Russian territory. Now, that was said by Shoigu yesterday. There were some who questioned the accuracy of that statement. A number of pictures trickled in over the course of the day, which appeared to show Ukrainian troops operating in Kozinka. I've made this point before. I'm going to make this point again. We can never be absolutely certain when pictures showing the presence of troops of any side in any particular location have been taken. For the record, I suspect those pictures were made before Shoigu made his statement. Just saying. Anyway, this morning, it appears to be generally acknowledged that Shoigu is correct and that the various attempts that the Ukrainians have tried to make over the last couple of days to infiltrate small groups of men into Kozinka have been completely unsuccessful, that the Russians have driven them out, and that there are, as of the time of making of this video, no Ukrainian soldiers in Kozinka or anywhere else in Belgorod or Kursk regions. Anyway, to move on, Ukrainian losses, this is again from Shoigu, in the area of the state border, covering groups amounted to more than 3,500, more precisely 3,501 people, including 790 non-recoverable casualties over the past 8 days. 23 tanks, 34 armoured vehicles, including 11 Bradleys, 5 Vampire multiple launch rocket systems, and 1 Mi-8 helicopter have been neutralised. And then Shoigu finishes by saying that thanks to the measures taken, it has been possible to save the lives of hundreds of people and to ensure that the election, in other words, was conducted peacefully. Now, let's focus on what he says about Ukrainian casualties. He's increased the number of dead and severely wounded Ukrainian troops committed to the attacks on Kursk and Belgorod from about 550, that was reported a couple of days ago, to 790, and I suspect that is correct. He says the 23 tanks were destroyed or severely damaged over the course of this operation, and 34 armoured vehicles, including 11 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, which is a very, very heavy toll indeed. Now, he also refers to 5 Vampire multiple launch rocket systems. Now, I'm not an expert in military technologies, as I've discussed many times, but to my understanding, the Vampire multiple launch rocket system is a Czech development of the Soviet Grad multiple launch rocket system that the Soviet Union introduced into its military back in the 1960s. The Czechs, over the course of the Cold War, took this particular system, the Grad system, and refined it substantially. They mounted it on a much larger and more powerful platform using a Tatra vehicle in place of the much smaller lorry that the Russians continue to use for the Grad. They installed a rapid refill system so that the Vampire could be re-equipped with missiles, rearmed with missiles much more quickly than the Grad could. Re-equipment with missiles on the Vampire is mechanical, whereas on the Grad system it is manual. And I understand that since the Cold War, further refinements have been done to the system, and the missiles have been given extended range and have been made more powerful. They are not, however, as I understand it, guided. It looks as if, for this particular operation, the Ukrainians resorted to use of the Vampire system supplied by the Czech Republic. It's a modern and advanced system, but as I said, it uses unguided rockets. The fact that they're having to use the Czech Vampire system makes me wonder whether HIMARS units are now in extremely short supply. Anyway, the Russians have been hunting these Vampire systems, these Vampire launchers, and according to Shoigu, as of yesterday, they destroyed 5. So it looks as if these systems have now also become targets for the Russians. I don't know how many the Ukrainians have, but I suspect a substantial proportion of these have now been lost. Anyway, Shoigu then goes on to make some very interesting claims about the state of the special military operation this year. In particular, he says that since the beginning of the year, 4 Abrams and 5 Leopard tanks, 27 Bradley vehicles, 6 HIMARS launchers, 11 anti-aircraft missile launchers, including 5 Patriots, have been neutralized. Now, that is a devastating number of losses. And, well, we all have heard about the Abrams tanks, which have been knocked out in BITCHUTE. Apparently, the Russians have examined one of them. There are pictures of Russian troops actually taking film and photographs of the interior of one of these Abrams tanks. Just saying. 27 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and 6 HIMARS launchers and 5 Patriots neutralized, which presumably means destroyed. Well, we can in fact confirm that. For all of these systems, except perhaps the Bradleys. This is a colossally high toll of extremely expensive assets. Just saying. I can remember how for months after the HIMARS launchers were delivered to Ukraine, the United States and Ukraine were denying that the Russians had destroyed any of them, and were saying that these HIMARS launchers are so elusive that they're almost impossible to destroy. We've had multiple pictures now of HIMARS launchers being destroyed. I don't think there's any doubt at all that the Russians are indeed successfully destroying them. And of course, the same is true of the 5 Patriot systems that Shoigu refers to, and that is a very, very high toll indeed. And note that the massacre of the Patriots, if I can use that expression, really started to get underway from late February. So this has been a relatively limited period of time in which air defense assets have been destroyed in very large numbers. But anyway, he then goes on to say, Shoigu then goes on to say that the Ukrainian losses during this period, i.e. since early 2024, I presume he means by that from the start of the year, have amounted to more than 71,000 people and 11,000 units of various weapons. This is almost 3 times higher than in the same period last year. Now, that is interesting because, of course, last year, January, February, March last year was the time of the Battle of Bakhmut. It culminated, of course, in a Russian capture of Bakhmut in May. It's acknowledged that the losses suffered by the Ukrainians, and by the way, the Russians too, over the course of the Battle of Bakhmut were extremely high, indeed horrendous. But Shoigu says that this year, in the first 2.5 months of 2024, Ukrainian losses have been 3 times greater than they were last year, at the same period last year. And he puts them at 71,000 men killed or severely wounded. Now, well, if this trend continues throughout the year, then Ukraine is standing to lose perhaps around 250 plus thousand men over the course of 2024. Level of losses that would be unsustainable. Now, of course, let me say again, point which I've made many times, we have no definite independent corroboration of these Russian claims. Zelensky recently said that the Ukrainians had lost 31,000 men dead. That was the totality of Ukrainian losses over the course of the entire special military operation. I don't think anyone takes that claim seriously. As has been pointed out, recently the Washington Post published an article from a Ukrainian village in the west of the country where there are basically no men of draft age, no men able to serve left. And, well, several people, including David Sachs, it's some very powerful messages on Twitter X, made the point that this is completely inconsistent with the claim that the number of losses the Ukrainians have suffered is only 31,000. So, however, that is the official figure that Zelensky himself has given. If the Russians are right, and to be frank, I think they probably are, then as I said before, these are unsustainable losses, and they go to explain the critical manpower shortage that by every account Ukraine is now suffering from. So anyway, that's what Shoigu says about Ukrainian losses. Then he goes on to say more, that the Russian armed forces have formed an army corps, a motorized rifle division, the Dnieper River Flotilla, and a riverboat brigade. Now, what does all of this mean? Is this forces for general commitment across Russia? Or are these forces for use in the zone of the special military operation? Well, I think it means the second, because the reference to the Dnieper River Flotilla and a riverboat brigade is most intriguing, and it begs a lot of questions, and it seems to be connected with the creation of the Army Corps and a motorized division. Now, Shoigu doesn't give figures for the numbers of men in these extra units, and we don't even know when these units were brought into operations. But it seems we're not looking at the full extent of the Russian build-up, because he then goes on to say, Shoigu then goes on to say, the Russian armed forces plan to form 2 combined arms armies and 13 formations, including 14 divisions and 16 brigades. So, are the 2 combined arms armies going to be also used in the zone of the special military operation? Or will they be deployed to counter the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO at the end, which has now taken place? Or are they to form a strategic reserve? Well, again, no one knows. But I would point out that between them, Sweden and Finland have militaries that number perhaps 50,000 men. That's the total number of forces that I understand Sweden and Finland taken together would be able to mount. 2 combined arms armies, 14 divisions and 16 brigades seems to me like massive overkill to counter the forces that the Scandinavians have in place. I can't help but think of many, or perhaps most of these troops are also ultimately destined for the zone of the special military operation. And this is consistent with what we have been hearing about the massive recruitment by the Russians of contract soldiers over the last year, starting from January the 1st, 2023, and continuing since then. It's a huge military build-up. The Russians take at least a year to train up forces, to train soldiers for combat roles. In some cases, it takes longer than that. And if we're talking about the totality of the forces that Shoigu is describing, 2 combined armies, 1 army corps, and apparently 15 divisions altogether and 16 brigades. That, I think, would be consistent with the enormous expansion of the Russian army that we have been seeing. And I suspect that most of this force is, in fact, eventually going to be committed to the zone of the special military operation. And we're getting reports also that the Russians are now developing more military equipment, that they're building many more aircraft, for example, that they're in the process of massively enhancing their drone fleets, that from mid-year they will be launching against Ukraine drone swarms, where the drones operate using artificial intelligence, which will give them a large measure of autonomy in selecting and destroying targets, which is a worrying thing in itself, by the way. It has various ethical implications, which I'm not going to explore in this program. But anyway, it looks like that is happening. We're getting reports that the S-70 Ochotnik heavy drone, stealth drone, is going to be operating, reusable drone, is going to be operating also over the zone of the special military operation. So all of this seems to be consistent with a major build-up by the Russians for the second half of 2024. Perhaps that's when the Russians will be ready to launch what they might decide is the knockout blow. Just say. Anyway, if that is right, then we will see what happens. But in the meantime, aggressive attrition continues. And we've had more news this morning. Firstly, the Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed the capture of Tonenka in the Avdiivka area. A report came out a short time ago, and we read the following: in Avdiivka direction, cohesive actions of the center group of forces have made possible the liberation of Tonenka. And so both Orlovka and Tonenka are now, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, in fact, I've no doubt that this is true, both Tonenka and Orlovka are now fully under Russian control. And I'm going to say again that I fully predict that in the next few hours, perhaps days at most, BITCHUTE will come finally under Russian control as well, and we will see the final collapse of the Ukrainian defense system that was hurriedly created by Syrsky along these three villages. And once this western defense line has been captured, as I understand it, there is no viable defense line that Ukraine could create prior to a water course, a small river system that lies some distance to the west, starting at Ocheretino. I've expressed my own belief that the Russians will advance all the way up to that river system. That will, for a time, probably a brief time, become the new front line. The Russians will probably not immediately seek to advance beyond that small river, though, to be frank, it doesn't look like much of an obstacle to me. Their focus instead, as I said, will be on clearing Pervomaisky, which is to the south of the area where the Russians are advancing now. And that Pervomaisky is very much in the Russian sight. That is suggested to me by another comment made in precisely this report, the same report by the Russian Defense Ministry, the one where they announced the capture of Tonenka. It says that strikes were delivered at formations of the 47th, 59th, and 59th Motorized Rifle Brigades and the 3rd Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian military near Pervomaisky and Berdychi. So we see the Russians talking about strikes against these three elite brigades, 47th Mechanized Brigade, one of the most storied brigades in the Ukrainian armed forces, created to spearhead Ukraine's offensive of the summer, which failed disastrously. The 3rd Assault Brigade is, of course, the Azov Brigade. But anyway, Russian strikes, in other words, offensive actions against these three brigades, these three elite brigades, with the Russian Defense Ministry specifying that they're taking place near Pervomaisky and Berdychi, those two villages in Pervomaisky, that small town, and Berdychi, both specifically mentioned, suggesting to me that they are now the priority captures that the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russian General Staff are looking at. So I think that that is the Russian plan, capturing Pervomaisky, well, first Berdychi, then Pervomaisky, before any further advances further west beyond the river line, which the Russians will be reaching shortly. And we have not actually had a huge amount of news over the last 24 hours from Pervomaisky, but there are reports that the Russians have been bombing the town of Krasnogorovka, south of Pervomaisky, heavily, and have been moving troops from Nivolskoye, this village to the south of Pervomaisky, to cut the roads in this area. And it could be that this is all part of this, as I said, strategy that the Russians are conducting. But anyway, we now have a number of reports from Russian officials as to exactly what is going on in this specific area. So Igor Kimakovsky, who is an advisor of Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government, he told TASS yesterday that our units keep pressing the enemy in the Avdiivka direction. They have placed several supply roads near the villages of Berdychi, Orlovka, and Umanskoye. Umanskoye is to the southwest of Tonenka, as I understand it, under gunfire control. And Kimakovsky then went on to say that the strikes will considerably complicate Ukrainian army's logistics in the frontline area. And we've also had a further report from a Russian drone operator called Zanoza, also in the Avdiivka area. He says that Ukrainian activities have significantly declined since we liberated Avdiivka. They are biting back, but not as boldly and brazenly as before. Their morale has dropped. And then we're told a fair amount about how drones operate in this area, Russian drones, FPV drones, I should say, and how these drones are repaired and how the drone operators are trained. But anyway, that's another debate. But overall, it seems that the Russians feel that they've broken the back of Ukrainian defenses west of Avdiivka, that they've managed to disrupt the supply to these forces, the Ukrainian forces there, and the Russian Defense Ministry is giving us, I think, to understand that Pervomaisky, after Berdychi, is the major objective. Now, there's also been lots of other reports about what's going on in other places. And we're getting lots of reports now from Georgievka, this village where there was this mass surrender of Ukrainian troops, which took place a few days ago. Well, I say mass surrender. 18 men in a platoon surrendered to the Russians. But there's lots of reports that the Russians have managed to bring much more of this village under control and of the areas around that village. There's also reports that the Russians have captured a lot more territory recently around Novomikhailivka. Curiously, they haven't made an attempt so far to storm the remaining Ukrainian positions in Novomikhailivka itself. Perhaps Novomikhailivka has received less attention recently, as the Russians have been more focused on Georgievka. Who knows? But anyway, lots going on there too, and clearly a big Russian advance taking place along in that area also. And this morning we got more news that the Russians are pressing again very hard in the Bakhmut area, trying to capture the remaining foothold that the Ukrainians still have in the village of Ivanivska. There's a lot of talk. Dima at the Military Summary Channel talks about it all the time, about the fact that control of a hill near Ivanivska enables the Ukrainians to control the territory to the northwest, an enclave to the northwest of Ivanivska. There's all sorts of complicated explanations as to how this particular hill would need to be captured, that various forested areas and tree lines would need to be captured, all of which, by the way, I'm perfectly willing to believe. But presumably, at some point, the Russians, having regrouped their forces and consolidated their gains, their very significant gains over the last few weeks, will go on the attack and will work towards capturing the village, fully capturing Ivanivska, at which point the advance on Chasov Yar will begin in earnest. And, well, we're also getting lots of reports from further north that the Russians are gradually, ever so gradually, but steadily, tightening their grip on the town of Siversk to the north of Bakhmut, area in northern Donetsk region, northern Donbass, never captured by the Russians up to this time. The Russians have been making various attacks towards Belogorovka, small town located some distance to the west of Siversk, which the Russians captured during 2022. They lost control of it during the Ukrainian Kharkiv counteroffensive. They've been heavily bombing Krasnogorovka over the last couple of weeks. They've been launching occasional attacks. They look more, to me, I have to say, like attritional attacks, weakening the overall defenses, rather than attempts to storm this place up to now. I know, again, that others take a different view. But anyway, they've been working for some weeks now on Belogorovka. And in the meantime, they've also resumed advances to the south of Siversk, even as they have been bombing Siversk itself very heavily. And further north, still, lots of reports that the Russians have now either entered Terny village on the Zherebets River or are on the brink of doing so. So we see how aggressive attrition continues to operate all across the front lines. And Shoigu has given us some sense of the effect of that. He claims, it is his claim, but as I said, I suspect it's probably true, that Ukraine has suffered losses of 71,000 men, dead and wounded, since the start of the year. They've lost very significant number of advanced air defense systems, 5 Bradley systems, according to him. They've lost large numbers of advanced Western tanks, 4 Abrams and 5 Leopard 2s, 27 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 6 HIMARS vehicles. They appear to have lost 5 Vampire multiple launch rocket systems within the last 8 days, sorry. Overall, it is a story of systematic destruction. A Ukrainian army that is trying desperately to cling on to the front lines, hoping that something will turn up to turn the situation round. Well, something did turn up in Kiev yesterday, something being Jake Sullivan, who arrived unannounced, or at least apparently at very short notice in Kiev, and this following a meeting in Ramstein of the contact group, which is intended to coordinate supplies of military equipment to Ukraine. Apparently the Ramstein meeting came up with nothing of significance. And beyond that, we've had the debacle, the farce about the French military deployments to Ukraine, which are on again, off again, probably, in my opinion, permanently off again. We had Sullivan himself telling the Ukrainians, whilst he was apparently in Kiev, that supply of the 300-kilometer range ATACMS missile with a unitary warhead is not yet being considered. Ukraine will get more ATACMS missiles, but they will be the shorter range system with the cluster warhead. And there's been reports, not so far really confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry, that the Russians are increasingly shooting them down. And of course, we've also had the recent decision by Germany that, at least for the time being, and despite apparently a campaign within the German government by Annalena Baerbock, that despite Baerbock's insistence that they be supplied, the German government and the German parliament have decided that Taurus missiles should not be supplied to Ukraine. So Jake Sullivan comes along to Kiev, and he's not the only person who's gone there. Others have also done so. There's reports that at around the same time that Jake Sullivan was there, probably in his company, a senior military official of NATO, I believe it was Admiral Bayer, was also in Kiev. And basically, the purpose of all these visits, and so far as I can see, also the purpose of the previous visit by Lindsey Graham, was to keep the Ukrainians fighting, despite the fact that Western military support seems to be dwindling away. If we go back to Lindsey Graham, he came to Kiev. He said that there's discussions underway in the United States about providing funding for further assistance for Ukraine. Only this funding will now take the form of a loan rather than an outright grant. A loan, in other words, by the United States to Ukraine rather than an appropriation by Congress for the administration to enable further funding of Ukraine. That all sounds rather complicated, and perhaps it is, but briefly it means that President Biden would not have an automatic drawdown authority whereby he could simply transfer weapons from the Pentagon's arsenal to Ukraine, because the money to replace these weapons would not be in place. Anyway, that's what providing all the aid to Ukraine as a package would amount to. In fact, it seems that the proposal which the Republicans are working on is, if anything, even more complicated than that, because the loan to Ukraine would amount to $12 billion, but the balance of the funding, however much that was, would still take the form of some kind of appropriation, which would enable President Biden to send weapons to Ukraine, exercising a drawdown authority. This is a very, very complex proposal. It's not at all clear how much support it would have in Congress amongst Republicans. It's clearly been explored and floated by people like Lindsey Graham. The key thing to say is that, for the moment at least, Speaker Johnson has confirmed that the House of Representatives has risen and is now on a break, and that discussions around this proposal, this new proposal, which are only in their early stage, will not begin until the middle of April. In other words, for several further weeks. All very complicated, all very unclear. Apparently the Ukrainians themselves extremely uncertain what to make of it all. But to me it looks like a complicated exercise in kicking the can down the road and waiting to see in the meantime what happens. So, Sullivan goes to Kiev. He goes empty-handed. He's got no new weapons to provide. He's got bad news about the ATACMS. Only the ATACMS missiles with the cluster warheads and the shorter range will be provided. The Germans, for the moment, are saying no to to supplies of the Taurus missiles. It's unknown what's happening with President Pavel's plan to supply Ukraine with 800,000 shells to be bought from various third parties. It's clear that the Western powers themselves have no further shells that they can give to Ukraine in any quantity. So it really all now depends on the success of President Pavel's plan. And we're now told that the earliest date that Ukraine is going to get any shells at all, even assuming that President Pavel's plan is successful, is a success, the earliest date that can happen is at the end of June. In other words, again, months away. So, the Ukrainians, finding themselves confronted with Sullivan and the NATO officials coming to see them after a Ramstein meeting, which produced nothing, the Ukrainians finding that these top people, Sullivan and co., have come to Kiev empty-handed. However, they didn't come only empty-handed, they came with demands. And the demand was set out by Lindsey Graham previously when he went to Kiev a few days ago. And the demand was that Ukraine expedite work on its mobilization plan, that it call up more people, the young people of Ukraine, the demographic from age 25. Edward Luttwak, whose column in the Daily Telegraph about the poor state of European militaries I discussed some days ago. Anyway, Edward Luttwak says that the Ukrainians should be conscripting young men not from age 25, but from age 18, which, I mean, is a horrendous idea. But anyway, it seems Lindsey Graham wants Ukraine to start calling up his young men to activate this mobilization plan. And I have a feeling that that is what Jake Sullivan was about also. He came along to the Ukrainians and said, look, we've got nothing to give you for the present time. We can't even give you the ATACMS missiles that you want. The Germans are not giving you the Taurus missiles. The French have been talking about sending you troops, but nobody in Europe really wants to send troops to Ukraine. Macron went off on a limb. There are no French troops heading your direction. The earliest date you're going to get any shells from the Czechs is going to be the end of June. But what we want you to do, nonetheless, is hold on. And hold on for as long as you can, because if you do hold on, eventually we will get some kind of an appropriation through for you, through the Congress. And of course, when that happens, everything will finally begin to come right. The flow of weapons and material and all of that can resume again, maybe not quite to the level that it did before, but at least sufficiently so that you can keep going. So all you've got to do in the meantime is to call up hundreds of thousands of young people who you haven't called up to now, put them in the army, give them a few weeks of training, provide them with rifles, send them to the battlefront, get them to die in horrendous quantities in order to buy yourself a few more months. I put it rather more brutally than Sullivan obviously will have done, but in essence, that, it seems to me, is what Lindsey Graham and, more importantly, Jake Sullivan were telling the Ukrainians. And of course, in Jake Sullivan's case, it's not difficult to see what the agenda is. He does not want a collapse in Ukraine before the presidential election in November. For him, for the Democrats, the ultimate calamity would be if the Ukrainian front lines collapsed in the summer, allowing the Russians to advance to, say, Kiev or Zaporozhye or Dnipro, to reach the Dnieper River, perhaps to cross the Dnieper River. The administration doesn't want a calamity like that to happen. They want to hold things together until the election itself is won. And I suspect Lindsey Graham's message is not that different. He won't have obviously told the Ukrainians that he wants Joe Biden to be re-elected, but he's probably trying to give the Ukrainians some reassurances that if Donald Trump, who Lindsey Graham supports, is re-elected, well, don't take some of his words too seriously, because he probably will come round and will also provide some material support for Ukraine. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians, in terms of direct military aid, need to look to Europe, because the United States currently isn't in a position to provide anything. Well, as I said, I've put it much more brutally and much more cynically than I'm sure Jake Sullivan and Lindsey Graham have put it. But that, in essence, is the message that I think they were giving to the Ukrainians. And I have to say, if I'm right, and I'm confident that I am, it is a horrible message. It is a message that tens of thousands of lives in Ukraine, young Ukrainians, should be sacrificed in the meat grinder, that more and more people are saying the Ukrainian conflict has begun. The meat grinder, which is devouring Ukraine, that tens of thousands more Ukrainians, young Ukrainians this time, should be shoveled into this meat grinder over the next few weeks and months, so that the United States, and in particular the administration, is spared a further embarrassment in an election year. I can't imagine that the Ukrainians themselves are pleased, but I suspect nonetheless that they will try as best they can to do that which the Americans are telling them to do. Because Zelensky and his officials have in effect boxed themselves in. There's been a series of comments by Ukrainian officials. One particularly scathing comment from, I think it was Alexei Danilov, the Secretary of the Ukraine's National Defense and Security Council. He spoke in frankly rather rude words about the Chinese emissary Li Hui, who's been trying to get the Ukrainians and the Europeans to start to see some sense. Danilov outright rejected that. He deliberately misspoke Li Hui's name, which is unnecessarily offensive. Li Hui has apparently been trying to get the Ukrainians to agree that the Russians should be invited to attend the next in the series of Copenhagen summit meetings in Switzerland. The Chinese have made it clear that if the Russians aren't there, China itself will stay away. And the Chinese have apparently been telling the Ukrainians that they must understand that the only conceivable basis upon which a peace agreement can be made is one whereby Ukraine accepts that territory is ceded to Russia. Well, Danilov, if it was him, certainly the Ukrainians are continuing categorically to rule that out. They still persist in sticking to Zelensky's peace plan, the plan whereby the Russians must completely withdraw all their forces from Ukraine, and then, only then, will the Ukrainians talk to them, and the basis of the talks will be terms essentially for Russia's surrender, payment of indemnities to Ukraine, that kind of thing. Interestingly, and it's been commented upon by several people, it seems that Sullivan himself might have been trying to lead the Ukrainians to an acceptance of the same position that Li Hui is trying to get them to accept. It was noticed that when Sullivan spoke about the United States' continued support for Ukraine, he spoke about Ukraine preserving its independence, its democratic institutions. Difficult to see what democratic institutions Ukraine has at present, but anyway, Jake Sullivan has, shall we say, a rather different type of eyesight than I have, at least on these matters. But anyway, Jake Sullivan spoke a lot about that, but interestingly, he omitted mentioning Ukraine's territorial integrity. He seemed to be preparing the ground for some kind of proposal whereby the Ukrainians cede control of some of their territory to Russia. I doubt, by the way, that what Sullivan is proposing or intended or wants to propose is at all acceptable to Moscow. It looks, I strongly suspect that this is Richard Haass, his conflict freeze idea, which the Russians have categorically rejected. But anyway, putting all that aside, I strongly suspect that that is what the Americans ultimately want to head towards, or realize they may have to head towards. But in the meantime, the pressure is to get the Ukrainians to move forward with their mobilization, and the Ukrainians, having taken the stance they have, rejecting outright the freeze idea, refusing to consider any kind of resolution to this conflict that falls short of their maximalist demands for return of all their post-1991 territory or pre-2014 territory. Anyway, the Ukrainians, it seems to me, are left with little choice but to do precisely those terrible things that the Americans are demanding of them. Now, will this nonetheless happen? I have to say that I've been seeing more and more reports that say that even if a mobilization bill is passed by the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, and comes into force, and even if the Ukrainian authorities are successful in enforcing its legal terms, there just aren't enough people left in Ukraine now, young people left in Ukraine now, to make up the numbers anyway. So people would be sacrificed for even less purpose, because given the shortages of manpower, there just aren't enough men left now of fighting age who can make up the numbers. What I have no doubt at all is that calling up large numbers of men, giving them basic training, and then throwing them into the battlefronts, all that is going to do is catastrophically deepen Ukraine's already calamitous demographic crisis. Now, I have to say that these American visits to Ukraine highlight the bankruptcy of American policy, and I have to say also of Ukrainian policy. The Ukrainians, the Maidan movement, have conducted a policy of maximalist demands ever since the Orange Revolution of 2004. They have never agreed to compromise either with their internal opponents within Ukraine itself, President Yanukovych, his party of the regions, when it still existed, the various opposition parties, the Russian speakers who wanted to continue to have the right to use their own languages, their own language in Ukraine, the business people in eastern Ukraine who wanted to maintain the economic links with Russia. The Maidan movement has never shown any willingness or ability to negotiate or compromise with them. It has never shown any ability or understanding of the need for compromise with the militias in the Donbass, who, I should stress again, did not originally seek outright independence from Ukraine. Back in 2014, when the protests there began, I remember that what people were demanding was not outright independence from Ukraine, but very extensive autonomy within a federal structure. Anyway, the Maidan movement has never been willing to concede that or to negotiate over it. I remember the peace plan that President Poroshenko announced, for example, in June 2014. There had been many hopes invested in this peace plan. It turned out to be nothing more than a demand for outright surrender by the militias in Donbass, something which guaranteed a war, which of course in 2014 Ukraine proceeded to lose. Then of course the Minsk agreement, Minsk II, was forced on Ukraine in 2015 after it suffered more defeats, but instead again of understanding that this was the only way back to peace in Ukraine, the Maidan movement collectively rejected it and refused to implement it and in effect subverted it. And since the conflict began in 2022, since the special military operation began, well, there was a brief moment after the shock of the entry of the Russian army into Ukraine between February and April 2022, when the Zelensky government did enter into negotiations with the Russians and did come very close to reaching an agreement with the Russians. But the West came along, told them that if they held out, they would in the end win. And given this history that the Maidan movement has consistently shown of sticking to maximalist demands, well, it simply reverted to type and has done so ever since. And we see that in terms of its willingness or ability to even contemplate negotiations, it is immovable. And I ought to say that, in my opinion, I think that there is almost no prospect at all, whatever happens now, that the Ukrainian government, the current Ukrainian government, the Zelensky government, will change its stance on this issue. So that is bankruptcy on the part of Ukraine, but also, of course, bankruptcy on the part of Ukraine's Western backers. They, too, have no ability to think of a way beyond the war, negotiating with President Putin, coming to a realistic agreement with him and with the Russian government generally, is something that they have so categorically ruled out that they're not able to do it, and they worry about the political consequences of doing so. So there we are. We are now in a state of intellectual and, frankly, moral bankruptcy. The Russian meat grinder, as the London Times horribly put it, is trundling westwards. It's just smashed through the Orlovka, Tonenka, Berdichi defense line. It's probably going to be closing on Kurakovo before long, and Chasov Yar also. Ukraine, short of air defense missiles, being pummeled by missile attacks by the Russians of increasing intensity. The Russian Air Force rampaging across the battlefronts, inflicting horrendous damage. Shoigu telling us that Ukrainian losses in the first 10 weeks of this year have numbered 71,000 men, which is 3 times more than was the case last year. massive losses of equipment, Patriot missile systems, HIMARS systems, advanced Western tanks, Czech Vampire systems, all of that. And the only thing that the West is able to do, and the Ukrainians themselves are able to do, or at least think they can do, is send more and younger Ukrainian men to the slaughter. I have never known in my time anything like this. Even Vietnam wasn't as bad as this. One has to go back to the events in Europe in the 1940s to find moral bankruptcy, which, well, obviously that was on a far greater scale then. But anyway, one could see, I suppose, some similarities. But there it is. That apparently is where we're going. Now, before I finish this program, I should say that Secretary Blinken is now saying that the United States is finally coming round to proposing a ceasefire resolution to the UN Security Council. Whether that is really the case, we're going to have to wait and see. I suspect that this will not be an open-ended ceasefire. It will be another attempt by the United States to impose a ceasefire that will be limited to just a few weeks, and that might not be acceptable to Hamas, and it might not get off the ground, but we will see what happens at the Security Council. I will say this about this particular resolution. It's not something that many people are saying, but it seems to be fairly clear that over the last couple of weeks, for some weeks now, the level of actual fighting in Gaza has actually reduced. That is not to suggest that there isn't fighting going on. That is not to suggest that lots of people aren't dying. That is not to suggest that the humanitarian situation is good. It's very, very, very bad. But the fighting, the bombing is not as intense as it was some months ago. And that may have bought the Americans a certain amount of time. And that might have been the point of this dialing down of what has actually been going on in Gaza. I wonder whether this so-called ceasefire, which I doubt, as I said, will actually be, in the end, a lasting ceasefire, whether that isn't just a further attempt to buy more time without making any substantive concessions towards a real settlement of the conflict in Gaza at all. Again, as with Ukraine, the objective is to just spin the thing through until the November election is out of the way. That, I'm sorry to say, seems to me to be the Biden administration's overriding priority at the moment. Anyway, this is where I finish my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Please remember that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Please also check out our shop. You can find all sorts of amazing things there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, shirts. We have a 15% discount on shirts and other things. And, well, also, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.